Their plans for financial aid, both students and parents in February and March told us we are planning on applying for aid. This is not unusual, and these actually percentages are very comparable to what we see in our research. However, what percentage of each of these groups actually applied for need-based aid? It did vary. You can see here the 4 groups. These are the, enrolled, whether or not they enrolled at a private or a public and what their preference was. And you can see here that the students who ultimately enrolled at a private institution, which is the first and the third bar there, they were more likely to have in fact applied for need-based aid. And in terms of whether or not they received need-based aid, the students who are enrolling at a private were more likely to report they are receiving aid. And also, especially the ones who are preferred a private and are enrolling at a private, they were much more likely than the other 3 groups to be receiving some form of merit aid from their enrollment school. Did appeals make a difference? You can see here that 22% of seniors and 21% of parents, so very similar percentage. Again, because, as I said at the very beginning, there was a slight difference in terms of the affluence, it's surprising some of the similarities between the students and the parents. They're both, comparable percentages report appealing. And then whether or not they appeal their financial aid offer does differ here, as you can see, by their preference and in actual enrollment decision, with students who are going to a private institution actually being more likely to have appealed their aid there. And in terms of whether or not their aid was increased, you can see, especially for the private students, that first one. So 25% of those students appealed, and 51% said their aid was actually increased as a result of the appeal. That's the highest percentage of the group, highest proportion of the group. How did the financial aid offer compare to expectations? One surprise here was that it's actually a fairly high percentage, higher than we might have expected, who said that their financial aid offer was higher than expected. So 22% of students and 14% of parents actually got a higher offer than they expected from their enrollment school. About a third said it was about what they expected, and then parents were a little more likely to say it was lower than they expected, as you can see there on the right. And how does this vary across these 4 groups? Similar trend. You can see the students who are enrolling at a private institution, they were more likely to say it was a higher award than they had expected from that institution.
Jim and Mary, I'll pose this to you first, and I'm sure Jack and Mark will be happy to comment, but where do you see the greatest risk of failure for your institution in terms of pricing and financial aid moving forward? And you're coming from very different perspectives on this.
Well, if I could start, I think the biggest risk is mixing up something that Jack, I assume, would caution us not to do, which is on the policy side, mixing up gross and net costs. We all talk in higher education about what's our rate of tuition increase, and that's what gets published. And there's a tendency to talk about student need in light of the gross price, as opposed to what the net price is going to be and how that's going to work out for students. So if you get confused about that, you could, at one time, flatten your tuition increase or hold your tuition increase down, but not make enough aid available to bring in a class. So to use Jack's word, pricing is a little bit an indelicacy, I guess. Could be indelicate in certain circles, but that's what it's about. It's about what the student and the family is going to see as the net cost to them. That's what we keep seeing in the data. So mixing up those two is problematic, and that's something that trustees and administration are going to have to face up to.
In the publics, it's there's similar factors, but it's a little bit more complex because of the reduction in public subsidies to our colleges. So we have to be very careful about increasing tuition and fees to a level that students can't afford. We can be sometimes a little cavalier in saying, well, we're extremely affordable, and we are, and there's a great value. But there's a limit to what you can do, particularly where most of our students traditionally come from lower income households. First-generation students. At my college this year, I think we've got 35% of our students applying are first-generation students. The largest, fastest-growing population in the country coming to our institutions will be Latinos, and we have to look at those income sectors. So in the publics across the country, we've really got to look at this gap in terms of what we're putting into our institutions, the investment from the public, and how much of a financial burden our students can manage as we raise fees and tuition to cover those gap pieces. So it's a delicate balance, and we have to watch it very carefully, or we could be excluding the very students who need access to our institutions.
Again, we're looking at 30,000 data points, reduced to 3,000 in May, huge numbers. And that one statement, echoing what has already been said, and I'll read the statement, it's important, exact wording. I'm more concerned with net cost of an institution after financial assistance from all sources has been determined. I'm not as concerned about the listed price of tuition. That was 5th on the list of student concerns going in, and it was number 1 coming out. It was the only one of those major statements that jumped, and we're talking statistical significance, 0.00001. What that message is for all of us is that, as Jim mentioned, the difference between gross and net price, sticker price, and what students and families will actually pay is not truly understood a year in advance or even months in advance of the final decision. And if we don't market that difference, then we could suffer at the beginning, that is no applications, and we could suffer at the decision point as it flows through March to May. And this is particularly true of low-income students. So we've got to do a better job than we do as institutions, public, private, selective, not so selective, in marketing price, gross and net price, and helping families to understand that. This data is very clear on that matter, and that's one of the most important data points in all of this research.
I think that the point that the difference between gross and net tuition, also distinguishing between net cost, which is what you get when you subtract the entire financial aid package from cost of attendance, and out-of-pocket cost, which is when you subtract just grants, are important distinctions that are of growing importance. And Congress and the Obama administration are in the process of setting up model financial aid award letters to make these distinctions clear. And there's going to be some forthcoming data about the cumulative debt of students who do and do not receive a Pell Grant, where students who receive a Pell Grant are 2 to 3 times more likely to borrow for their education than students who don't receive a Pell Grant. And the average cumulative debt at graduation is several $1,000s more among the Pell Grant recipients than among the non-Pell Grant recipients. So I mean, that's important. And it's also worth noting that the stimulus bill had this maintenance of effort clause that if you accepted the money, you had to keep the same contribution, the state had to keep the same contribution to colleges as they had in 2006 in 2009, 10, and 11. That doesn't mean that they increase the financial aid. It just means that they have this baseline that I mean, they could keep tuition from increasing, but also keep financial aid from increasing. So I think those are important issues.